Hello, everyone. My name is Jacob, and today, I want to take you on a deep dive into my journey of learning English. This isn't just a story of success but of perseverance, failures, self-doubt, and ultimately triumph. Every step of the way, I encountered obstacles, but each one taught me something invaluable. If you've ever felt afraid, frustrated, or unsure of how to move forward in your English learning journey, trust me, I know exactly how you feel. I hope that by sharing my experiences, the good and the bad, you'll find the inspiration and motivation to keep pushing forward. Your journey to fluency starts here. I still remember the first time I tried to speak English. My heart was pounding, my hands were shaking, and my mind went completely blank. I was so nervous that I couldn't even say a simple sentence. The words were there, but they wouldn't come out. It felt like an invisible barrier was blocking me, as if my own fear was holding my tongue hostage. My breath became shallow, my palms were sweating, and all I could think about was the fear of embarrassing myself. The person in front of me smiled patiently, waiting for me to say something. I could feel my throat tighten. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours, and in my mind, I was screaming at myself to just say anything. But no words came. My first attempt ended in silence, and I walked away feeling defeated. I replayed the moment in my head over and over again, wondering why my mind had gone blank. It wasn't that I didn't know the words. I had practiced them many times before. But when the moment came to speak, fear took over. My confidence was nowhere to be found, and I felt ashamed. That night, I sat in my room, staring at my notes, wondering if I would ever be able to break free from this anxiety. But instead of giving up, I decided to change my approach. If I couldn't speak in real conversations just yet, I would practice in front of a mirror. I started with basic greetings, forcing myself to say, "Hello, my name is Jacob," repeatedly until it felt natural. I whispered conversations under my breath while walking alone. I narrated my daily activities in English, even if no one was listening. Slowly, I built a habit of speaking, and though the fear didn't disappear overnight, I was beginning to chip away at it. For days, I replayed that moment in my head, wondering why it was so difficult. It wasn't just about the words, it was about confidence, about overcoming the fear of making mistakes. I realized that fluency wasn't just about grammar or vocabulary, but about believing in myself. And from that moment on, I made a decision: I would not let fear control me. I would find a way to break through this invisible wall and make English a part of my life, no matter how long it took. I had always admired people who could speak English fluently. They made it look so effortless, but for me it felt impossible. I had doubts. Was I too old to learn? Was I not smart enough? Would people laugh at me? These thoughts haunted me every time I tried to practice. Each failed attempt only deepened my insecurity, making the journey seem even more daunting. I often compared myself to others, wondering how they managed to speak so confidently while I struggled to form even the simplest sentences. I imagined that they had some natural talent that I lacked, that perhaps they were simply born with a gift for languages. It seemed unfair, almost as if I was destined to struggle while they thrived effortlessly. But deep down, I knew the real issue wasn't my ability, it was my mindset. I had conditioned myself to believe that fluency was something you either had or didn't have, rather than a skill that could be built with time and practice. Instead of feeling discouraged, I started studying successful language learners. What made them different? How did they practice? I realized they weren't afraid to make mistakes. They embraced errors as part of the learning process. They took every opportunity to speak, even when they stumbled over words or had imperfect pronunciation. They surrounded themselves with English at every chance, making it a part of their daily lives rather than treating it as a subject to be studied. This shift in mindset was crucial. I stopped obsessing over perfection and focused on progress. I reminded myself that learning a language is like learning an instrument. No one expects a beginner pianist to play a perfect sonata immediately. So why did I expect myself to speak perfect English from the start? With this realization, I began to approach English differently. I welcomed the challenge, knowing that every conversation, every mistake, and every small success was bringing me closer to fluency. Instead of avoiding English, I decided to observe how fluent speakers talked. I paid attention to their pronunciation, their expressions, and even their body language. I watched interviews, studied speeches, and listened carefully to how they responded in conversations. Slowly, I started mimicking them in private, speaking out loud to myself, repeating sentences until they felt familiar. I wasn't fluent yet, but I was beginning to bridge the gap between my fear and my ability. Little by little, I started seeing English as a puzzle rather than an obstacle. Each new word was a piece, and with practice, I could fit them together to form a bigger picture. My doubts didn't disappear overnight, but I learned something crucial. Progress in language learning isn't about perfection, it's about persistence. And so I pushed forward, determined to turn my fear into confidence. At first, I avoided speaking English as much as I could. I was afraid of making mistakes. Every time I opened my mouth, I felt like I was exposing my flaws to the world. But deep inside, I knew that if I wanted to grow, I had to face my fear. So I made a promise to myself. No matter how many mistakes I made, I would not give up. I started speaking little by little, first to myself, then to close friends, and eventually in public. I reminded myself that fluency wasn't about perfection, but about perseverance. I embraced the awkward moments, the mispronunciations, and the moments of self-doubt as stepping stones on my journey to mastering the language. I knew that if I wanted to improve, I had to immerse myself in the language. But where would I start? I decided to listen first. I started with English music, watching cartoons, and listening to simple conversations online. At first, it was overwhelming. The words blurred together, and I couldn't understand much. But I didn't stop. I experimented with different types of content. I listened to slow-spoken podcasts meant for English learners, repeated phrases I heard in music, and even mimicked cartoon characters. My goal was not just to hear the words but to feel their rhythm and intonation. I started shadowing speakers, playing a sentence and repeating it immediately, trying to match their tone and speed. This technique was incredibly effective in training my ears and tongue to work together in English. One day, I stumbled upon an audiobook of a familiar story. Since I already knew the plot in my native language, I found it easier to understand the words in English. This was a game changer. I began reading and listening to books at the same time, reinforcing my comprehension skills and pronunciation. Every morning during my commute, I would plug in my earphones and let the English words flow through my mind. I wasn't just hearing English, I was living it. Instead of trying to understand everything at once, I focused on recognizing sounds and intonations. I trained my ears to catch familiar words and identify recurring phrases. I would pause recordings and repeat sentences multiple times, mimicking the pronunciation and tone. I experimented with different accents, trying to distinguish American, British, and Australian pronunciations. It was challenging at first, but the more I practiced, the easier it became. To reinforce my listening skills, I engaged in active listening exercises. I listened to podcasts while taking notes on unfamiliar words. I challenged myself to summarize what I heard in my own words. Sometimes, I even recorded my own voice repeating sentences from audio materials, comparing my pronunciation with the original speakers. This exercise made me more aware of subtle pronunciation differences and helped refine my speaking skills as well. Slowly, I started recognizing patterns in everyday speech. Common expressions and sentence structures became familiar, and I found myself predicting the next words in conversations. My brain was no longer passively absorbing the language, it was actively processing and anticipating meaning. The more I listened, the more confident I became in understanding spoken English without relying on subtitles or translations. One of my biggest breakthroughs came when I started watching movies with subtitles. I would watch a scene in my native language first to grasp the context, then switch to English with subtitles, and finally, watch it again without any help. This method helped me connect spoken words with their meanings and improved my pronunciation. Over time, I experimented with different genres, from animated films to dramas, to expose myself to various accents and speech patterns. I would even pause scenes, repeat the lines aloud, and mimic the actors' intonations and expressions. This practice not only refined my pronunciation, but also helped me grasp common idioms and natural speech rhythms. Eventually, I found myself watching entire movies without subtitles, understanding dialogues effortlessly, and even recognizing subtle nuances in characters' tones and emotions. Listening was one thing, but speaking was another challenge entirely. I was still afraid of making mistakes. Every time I tried, I hesitated, fearing that I would mispronounce words or say something incorrect. But then, I had a realization: children don't learn to speak by studying grammar first. They just speak, and they make mistakes along the way. They listen, absorb, and repeat until the words become second nature. So, I decided to adopt the same approach. Rather than overthinking every sentence, I would allow myself to speak freely, embracing mistakes as stepping stones toward fluency. So, I started speaking to myself. I would describe everything I did in English: I am brushing my teeth, I am cooking dinner, I am walking to work. It felt silly at first, but it helped me think in English. Soon, I expanded my practice by narrating my thoughts and actions in more detail. I am cutting vegetables for dinner, and I need to be careful with a knife. I am walking down the street, noticing the birds chirping and the wind blowing through the trees. As I became more comfortable, I pushed myself further by engaging in imaginary dialogues. I would pretend I was introducing myself to someone new or asking for directions in a foreign city. Sometimes, I would even act out scenarios like ordering food at a restaurant, bargaining at a market, or explaining my day to a friend. These exercises made me more confident and allowed me to practice a wide range of vocabulary naturally. To take my practice to another level, I started recording myself speaking. At first, hearing my own voice in English felt awkward, but over time, I noticed improvements in my pronunciation and fluency. By listening to my recordings, I identified areas where I needed to improve and worked on refining my accent. This method also helped me track my progress, motivating me to continue practicing every day. I also started role-playing conversations. I would pretend I was ordering food at a restaurant or introducing myself to someone new. I imagined dialogues with strangers, rehearsing possible responses. The more I practiced, the more natural it felt. Eventually, I started talking to my reflection in the mirror, observing my expressions and gestures as I spoke. This not only improved my confidence, but also made English feel like a more natural part of my daily routine. Then, I took it a step further. I joined an online community where people were learning English. I found a language partner, and we agreed to practice together every day. At first, I was embarrassed. My sentences were slow, and I mixed up words, but my partner was patient. He corrected my mistakes kindly, and over time, I became more confident. We started by exchanging short text messages, then moved to voice notes, and eventually we scheduled video calls. The first time I spoke on video, I felt my voice trembling, but I pushed through. Each conversation made me more comfortable, and I realized that fluency was not about speaking perfectly but about expressing myself clearly. My partner and I shared our cultural backgrounds, discussing books, movies, and even daily routines. These conversations made learning English feel more natural and engaging, and I found myself looking forward to our practice sessions rather than fearing them. I had never been much of a reader in my own language, so reading in English seemed intimidating. But I decided to start small: children's books, short stories, even comic books. At first, I struggled to grasp the meaning of sentences, often needing to reread paragraphs multiple times. However, as I continued, I realized that repetition helped me absorb new vocabulary and sentence structures more naturally. I started keeping a vocabulary journal where I would write down new words along with their definitions and example sentences. I reviewed these words daily and challenged myself to use them in sentences. This practice helped reinforce my learning and made new vocabulary feel more familiar. Gradually, I moved on to longer books and novels, choosing topics that genuinely interested me. I found that when I was engaged in the story, I was less focused on translating each word and more immersed in the experience. Over time, I stopped relying on translations altogether and learned to infer meanings from context. To push myself further, I began reading aloud. This not only improved my pronunciation, but also helped me internalize sentence structures more naturally. Additionally, I started summarizing what I read in my own words, reinforcing comprehension and helping me practice expressing my thoughts in English. Reading eventually became a habit, and I found myself looking forward to exploring new books and articles. The more I read, the more confident I became in my ability to understand and communicate in English. What once felt like a daunting challenge had turned into a source of personal growth and enjoyment. I experimented with different genres, exploring adventure stories, science fiction, and mystery novels. I found that choosing books with engaging plots made the process more enjoyable, encouraging me to read for longer periods. I also started using dual language books, reading the English text first and then referring to the translation to check my understanding. Over time, my confidence grew, and I moved on to more complex texts, such as biographies and newspapers. Eventually, reading became a habit, and I no longer saw it as a daunting task. It became a source of learning and enjoyment, reinforcing my grammar, vocabulary, and comprehension skills in ways I had never expected. I began to challenge myself by reading more complex materials, such as opinion articles, essays, and academic texts. I also started annotating passages, writing summaries, and discussing what I read with others to deepen my understanding. The more I read, the easier it became, and I found myself thinking in English even outside of my reading sessions. I would catch myself mentally summarizing my day in English, forming questions about the world in English, and even dreaming in the language. Reading had transformed from a practice to an immersive experience, truly integrating English into my daily life. One day, I picked up a simple book and forced myself to read one page a day. At first, I needed a dictionary for almost every sentence, and progress felt slow. But I was determined to push through. I highlighted new words, wrote them down in a notebook, and reviewed them daily. Over time, I started recognizing familiar phrases without needing to look them up. Eventually, I found myself reading entire paragraphs fluently, understanding the context without constant translation. It was a moment of triumph, realizing that English was no longer a foreign code to decipher, but a language I was starting to think in naturally. Reading helped me see how words were used in context, reinforcing my understanding of sentence structures and expressions. It also improved my vocabulary naturally, exposing me to new phrases and idioms that I could use in real-life conversations. I realized that learning English wasn't just about memorizing words. It was about understanding how they fit together in real communication. The stories and articles I read provided examples of natural dialogue, helping me see the rhythm and flow of the language. Over time, reading not only enhanced my comprehension, but also gave me the confidence to apply what I had learned in conversations and writing. Writing was another skill I had to develop. I knew that writing would help me organize my thoughts, improve my grammar, and reinforce new vocabulary. So, I started keeping a journal. Every night, I wrote a few sentences about my day in English, describing not only what happened but also my feelings, thoughts, and reflections on different experiences. At first, my entries were very simple. Today, I went to the park. It was sunny. But as time passed, I challenged myself to write longer and more detailed reflections. I added new words I had learned that day, experimented with different tenses, and even attempted to describe events with more emotion and complexity. I started incorporating dialogue, internal monologues, and descriptions of my surroundings to make my writing more vivid. I would set small challenges for myself, such as writing an entry entirely in the past tense or using a new idiom correctly in context. Over time, my writing evolved from basic observations to rich narratives, allowing me to capture my thoughts more precisely and develop a deeper appreciation for the expressive potential of the English language. To make writing more engaging, I explored different formats beyond daily journaling. I tried writing opinion pieces on topics that interested me, creating fictional short stories, and even composing letters to my future self. This variety made writing feel less like a task and more like an opportunity for creative expression. The more I wrote, the more comfortable I became with forming sentences and expressing myself fluently in English. At first, I made many mistakes. My grammar was inconsistent, my sentences were fragmented, and I often struggled to find the right words to express my thoughts. But instead of feeling discouraged, I embraced them as part of the learning process. Each mistake became an opportunity to improve. I would go back and correct my writing the next day, carefully analyzing where I went wrong and how I could phrase things better. I also sought feedback from native speakers and language exchange partners, which gave me valuable insights into how I could refine my writing further. Over time, my sentences became longer, my ideas clearer, and my confidence grew. What once felt like a daunting challenge turned into an enjoyable creative outlet where I could express myself freely in English. One of the best exercises I did was writing short stories. I would write about imaginary adventures, daily experiences, or even rewrite my favorite movie scenes in my own words. I experimented with different genres, from mystery to science fiction, which not only helped me expand my vocabulary but also made the process more engaging. Writing allowed me to express myself in English in a way that speaking sometimes didn't, giving me the freedom to explore new ideas and refine my sentence structures at my own pace. Over time, I developed a habit of crafting longer, more detailed narratives, challenging myself to incorporate complex sentence structures and advanced vocabulary. This exercise also helped me improve my storytelling skills, making my writing not just grammatically sound but also compelling and expressive. One of the most difficult but rewarding parts of my journey was learning to think in English. At first, I translated everything in my head, but this slowed me down and made conversations feel unnatural. I realized that fluency required me to process English directly without relying on my native language. So, I started forcing myself to think in English whenever I could, even for the smallest thoughts and internal dialogues. I described my surroundings, planned my day, and even debated ideas with myself, all in English. The more I did this, the more naturally the language flowed, and over time, I found that my ability to express myself improved dramatically. I practiced by looking at objects and naming them in English, sometimes even describing them in full sentences. If I didn't know a word, I would look it up, write it down, and use it throughout the day in different contexts. To reinforce my learning, I started labeling items in my home with sticky notes containing their English names. This method helped me build an immediate connection between objects and their corresponding words. Additionally, I began narrating my daily actions as if I were explaining them to someone else. For instance, while cooking, I would say things like, "I am chopping onions and preparing the sauce for the pasta." This not only helped me recall words, but also strengthened my ability to form coherent sentences on the spot. I also incorporated word association techniques, connecting new vocabulary with familiar concepts or images in my mind. For example, I linked the word serene with the image of a peaceful lake. This mental imagery made it easier for me to recall words effortlessly in conversations. Slowly, my brain started processing English naturally, without needing translation. I found myself thinking in English more frequently, even when I wasn't actively trying. Simple thoughts like, "What should I eat for lunch?" or "I need to finish this task" were now forming in English, without the need to revert to my native language. My sentences flowed with greater ease and spontaneity, and I noticed a significant improvement in my confidence when speaking and writing. I even started dreaming in English occasionally, a clear sign that the language had become deeply embedded in my subconscious. This shift allowed me to engage in conversations more fluidly, without hesitation or overthinking each word before speaking. The fear of making mistakes lessened, and I embraced the process of learning with excitement rather than anxiety. This was a turning point for me. It made speaking faster, writing easier, and reading more enjoyable. My confidence grew as I realized that I no longer needed to translate in my head. I began to notice patterns in the language, making it easier to form sentences naturally. Books that once felt intimidating became enjoyable, and conversations that used to cause anxiety became opportunities for growth. The more I practiced, the more comfortable I became, and soon, English became not just something I was learning, but a part of my daily thinking process. There were times when I wanted to quit. Learning a language is not easy, and there were moments when I felt stuck, frustrated, and doubtful of my abilities. I questioned whether I was making any real progress, especially when I struggled to understand native speakers or when I made the same mistakes repeatedly. But I reminded myself why I started, because I wanted to connect with more people, access new opportunities, and challenge myself to grow. Whenever I felt discouraged, I looked back at how far I had come and used that as motivation to keep pushing forward. To stay motivated, I set small goals: learn 5 new words a day, read 1 article a week, write a journal entry in English, and have a conversation in English every day. I also practiced speaking out loud to myself and recorded my voice to track my pronunciation improvements. These little victories, no matter how small, kept me moving forward and reinforced my commitment to mastering the language. I also surrounded myself with English. I changed my phone settings to English, started thinking in English, and even dreamed in English. I listened to English podcasts during my commute, watched TV shows without subtitles, and read books out loud to reinforce pronunciation. I joined online forums where I could interact with native speakers, which helped me practice informal conversations and slang. The more I embraced the language, the faster I improved, as English became a natural part of my daily life rather than just something I was studying. After years of dedication, something amazing happened. One day, I found myself having a full conversation in English without hesitation. The words flowed effortlessly, and I responded naturally without second-guessing myself. I no longer needed to translate in my head. I understood jokes, idioms, and even slang, picking up subtle nuances that once seemed impossible to grasp. I could engage in discussions, express my opinions, and even tell stories with confidence. It felt as though a door had opened to an entirely new world of connection and expression. It was one of the greatest feelings of my life. I realized that learning English had given me more than just a language. It had transformed my entire perspective. It had given me confidence to express myself, opened doors to new opportunities one had never imagined, and allowed me to connect with people from diverse cultures and backgrounds. The ability to communicate fluently in English had become a powerful tool that enriched my life, both personally and professionally. If you're struggling with English, remember this: I was once where you are. I doubted myself. I made mistakes. There were moments of frustration and times when I wanted to give up. But I kept going, finding small victories in each lesson, each conversation, and each new word learned. If I could do it, so can you. Just keep pushing forward, one step at a time. Learning English is a continuous adventure, filled with challenges and rewards. Embrace the process, acknowledge every small achievement, and view mistakes as valuable lessons rather than setbacks. Every effort you put in brings you closer to mastering the language and unlocking new opportunities. You have everything you need to succeed. Keep listening, speaking, reading, and writing. Challenge yourself to step out of your comfort zone, seek conversations, and embrace every opportunity to use English. Believe in yourself, stay persistent, and one day, you'll share your own inspiring journey just like I did today. Thank you for listening to my journey. Now go out there and start your own. If you found my story inspiring and helpful, don't forget to support this journey by subscribing to the channel, liking this video, and sharing it with your friends. The more we engage with English together, the more we grow. Let's keep building our vocabulary and learning in a fun and professional way. See you in the next video.